Welcome to Thinking Green. We have a ton of information here tonight. So I'm going to go right into introducing tonight's guest. Professor Norman Garrick was last here about 6 years ago and was one of the people who got the Hodges Square revitalization and some of the Riverside Park revitalization started in New London. He's a professor of transportation engineering at UConn, and we're going to talk about some really hot button issues that have come up in New London recently: parking, traffic, street design, stuff like that. So welcome, Norman. I can't believe we waited 6 years to ask you back.
Thank you for having me back. It's really a pleasure.
And so today I saw on Facebook someone had complained about getting a parking ticket in downtown New London in a time-restricted lot that was mostly empty. And I couldn't help but think that we're doing it wrong. So I know that parking in cities is something you've studied at length. So I think we can just kind of go into your presentation.
Okay. So parking is something that everybody gets mad about when you get ticketed. I mean, regardless of your feeling or your researching the issue in depth. But what I'd like to talk about is not about the individual reaction, but our collective behavior and how we manage parking. And I've been studying parking for about 8 years now and trying to understand the impact of parking on cities. One of the things that we have seen is just how much Connecticut cities of all sizes have been swallowed up essentially by parking. And so we've been trying to follow that trend of research for a long time.
And of course, in Connecticut, all of our cities are poor cities. So is there a link? Maybe.
Well, that's an interesting question. For a long time, we have been looking at cities that increase parking a lot over the last 50 years. But there has also been a handful of cities that did not increase parking. And we have shown this a lot in our work. And some people would question how we went about the research, because the cities that did not increase parking, places like Cambridge, are cities that are much wealthier than cities like Hartford, which increase parking. Right. And so one of the questions that led to is there a cause and effect relationship? And so the last paper that we produced actually tried to look at that very issue.
So did you conclude that it's a coincidence, or is there a real influence?
So let me tell you give you a little bit more background as to how we went around trying to look at this. So in the 50s and 60s, there was the doctors saw a correlation between smoking and lung cancer. And the same kind of argument we hear, okay, there's a correlation, but that doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So a British doctor came up with a set of criteria for inferring causation in situations where you cannot have a controlled experiment, which is exactly the same thing you have in parking. So I came up with the idea a few years ago of using these criteria, the Bradford Hill criteria, to see if what we were seeing in our cities was a causation rather than just correlation. And the conclusion was yes. After going through very meticulously all of the steps, we felt that indeed that Hartford, New Haven, and a lot of other cities like that are in the situation they are in because, not really just because of parking, but because they were trying to change their very nature. They were trying to become a car-friendly places.
And on a much smaller scale, New London fits that same pattern.
Well, New London is an extreme case. I mean, you're driving in from stores, you go through that ridiculous interchange which takes up half the land in this very, very tiny city, and you realize, how can this be? I mean, how can that not have a massive economic impact.
Oh, yeah. In fact, we always hear about how small New London is in terms of land mass, 5.5 square miles, and yet we have a lot of wasted land within that 5.5
Well, to
square
put it in
miles.
perspective, in downtown Hartford, almost a quarter of the land there is devoted to parking. And I would suspect that downtown New London is even worse. And then when you take into account the wide roads, the freeways, etc., you understand how much of your valuable, tiny little town is being used for automobiles.
Now, because parking is such an emotional subject for people and businesses, and there's so much fear that if you get rid of free parking in large quantity, no one will come downtown. I know you have some slides, and maybe we can just talk generally about the parking issue.
Well, actually, before we get to the slides, let me give it. Firstly, what I want to say is the term free parking is a really kind of interesting one, because what we are actually trying to show, and what I think what we have shown with our research, is that there's no such thing. That somebody is paying for parking.
So it might not be the drivers, but there's a cost.
It's not the driver, but there is a huge cost. I think that is really the message. That is one way that we can start changing the conversation, is to understand that parking is never free. So
even though people all say they want free parking and they want lots of it,
they want free parking, but somebody is paying for it.
Yeah.
We're subsidizing people that essentially can afford it. So it's, and it's coming at such a cost to the society as a whole. Even the people that are being subsidized pay the cost, because they pay the cost with cities that don't give them all the pleasure that cities should give them, because you're being compromised to provide the amount of parking that is needed.
And as a result, in a place like New London, you really do need a car.
Yes. So let me see what is here.
Yes. Yeah.
So one of the things that I like to start my presentations with is to look at how much driving that we have been doing in the U.S. how much driving has increased over the last 100 years in the U.S. And this is an interesting roadmap of the issue of all issues relating to transportation in cities. And you can see this graph started the uptick around 1908, which of course, if you're a history buff, you know that was when Henry Ford's first Model T came off the line.
So cars started to be mass-produced.
Cars started to be mass-produced by the mid-20s. There were millions of cars in the U.S. We had maybe 70% of all the cars in the world were in the U.S. And so you can see the uptick. But what's interesting about this slide is not just that we have increased parking. We have increased driving. Let me see if I can get it to go to the next. But is the fact that as a country, the blue level there is on a per capita basis would be the next highest country in the world. So we're driving more than any other country in the world.
And a lot more than double.
More than double. So, and so when you think about what this means, this is about the amount of people that are being killed. We now have the worst traffic fatality record of any developed country in the world by far. This is about the amount of carbon we're producing. This is the amount of energy we're using. This is why we're in the Middle East to the extent that we are. So there's a lot that is embedded in this graph. So one of the things that we have looked at over the years is what happened in different cities. And one of the things that is interesting to look at is just how much our cities change. And this is a book that was written about Buffalo, New York, and I chose it because it actually documents some of the changes in Buffalo, and it talks about how in the 1950s the city was losing population to the
Sure.
suburbs. And so they felt something had to be done. And that sounds like everywhere in America. I'm sure it sounds
Sure.
like New London.
Yeah, and
Well-
I grew up in Philadelphia. There was the same. I remember in the late 50s,
Yes.
early 60s, the movement out to the suburbs.
And what I've since discovered is that this was not just an American thing. European cities were undergoing the same thing. What is different between American cities and European cities was what we felt had to be done. So there was this emergency, and all the politicians were saying something had to be done, something soon and something big. And of course, what that meant in America was building freeways. We had free federal monies to build freeways, so we built freeways in the cities. But beyond that, so all these freeways were bringing in the cars from the suburbs. And beyond all of that was the building of parking, because one of the implications of changing your city into a car-ready city
Right.
is that you have to put the cars someplace. You have to park
Right.
them someplace. So Buffalo is interesting because Buffalo, in the 1960s, the metropolitan area was about 1 million. And they did all of this freeway building, all of this parking. 60 years later, the population of the metropolitan area is 1.2 million. It went from 1 million to 1.2 million. The difference is that people were all living close to downtown.
Right.
Now they're living all over the land.
And we've seen that in New London too, that the population in 1960 was larger than now, about
Yeah.
34, 35,000. But everyone was living within about a mile of the train station downtown.
Yes.
Now there's 28,000, but they live all the way to the boundaries of the city, actually.
Definitely, all over the area. So what we got was that we had compact city living, and we had the cars coming into these kinds of places, and instead of having growth, what we had was sprawl. So to get to anywhere, you had to pay more money. So part of what happened with that was that the cost, transportation as a percentage of household budget was negligible in the early parts of the century. Now, in a lot of places, it's up to 20-30%
Wow.
of your income. So you're thinking that this modernism is leading to progress. And it's really about how where our resources as a society is going.
Right, and you mentioned the financial cost of sprawl, but there's the environmental cost of sprawl as well.
Yeah, but I'm fascinated by the financial cost, because as a country we claim that this is what is really important.
Yeah.
But it's never been accounted for. We've never made the connection between our transportation system and the actual what it's actually costing in financial terms, our society.
It's probably
So-
more than we think.
It's much more than we think. So in Buffalo, and again, this is common all over the place, they decided that they were going to build lots of parking, 14,000 spaces they said they needed. And the mayor decided that they would subsidize this. They would encourage the building of parking garages. And the big thing was that they decided that the way that they would facilitate it, the private people could build it, but they would assemble the sites. And if you think of what that means, it means that a city like this, the cityscape like this, they'll be taking down a lot of those buildings for parking lot. So you go to Buffalo, you go to New London, and it's really what you see there on the ground is the end result of this process. So this is a one corner in Buffalo, and this is what it currently looks like.
Wow.
And
How
I'm sure,
depressing.
again, you could repeat
Yeah.
this story over and over for New London. So This is what Hartford looked like in 1957 in terms of the amount of parking, in terms of the buildings. So green and yellow and blue are the different buildings and the different buildings in terms of heights. Red is parking. This is 1957. By 2009, this is what Hartford looked like. And I think it's worth repeating that. So this is what we went from to that.
And I think the population of Hartford fell
The
during
population went from 180. So this is just downtown, but the population of the town as a whole fell from 180,000 to 120. The jobs downtown stayed steady. There was no increase in jobs downtown. The retail sector disappeared. So you wonder what this brought to the city. And you know, the first time I saw a map like this, I used to live in Hartford, and the first time I saw this, I said to myself, now I understand what happened to Hartford.
Yeah. Now, are the parking lots actually full?
We haven't looked at that in detail, but so there are different ways of answering that question. If you go to Hartford tonight, you're probably going to find parking around the Civic Center where the Yukon game is going on in great demand, but just around the Civic Center. Nobody's actually going to be walking any distance in this city because it's such a scary experience at night. During the day, some lots are full. My guess would be that it's probably no more than 60 to 70% full on a regular day. But you know, most of the time, these spaces are not being used for anything, even then. If you look outside of the business hour, because that's what this has become, is an office park.
Yeah, a lot of it is government related. And
oh, that's an interesting story. So if you look at the southern part of this map, that's almost all state of Connecticut. The state of Connecticut has a union contract that demands that you have a free parking space within, I think, 200 feet of your office.
Wow.
So a lot of that is for state employees, and the state has done this largely to Hartford. One of the interesting things we found in researching this is that some of the insurance companies have a much less laissez-faire attitude towards parking, and they actually charge for parking. And in so places like Travelers, so it ends up that travelers use transit at a much higher rate than the state employees. So just the numbers, parking in Hartford went from 16,000 to 47,000, tripled the amount of parking. So in our research, the question we ask is, why should this be? Why would this happen, and what is the implication of this? How is this related to what is actually going on in the city? And in essence, what we found when looking at other cities, not just Hartford, this is a plot showing the amount of people in the city versus the amount of parking. And you can see, let's go back there, that there is a really good relationship between the amount of parking. And as a colleague of mine from New York says, more parking, less city. And some of the cities on there, the farthest to the right is Lowell, Mass. And Cambridge is the one with the least parking and the most people, Cambridge, Mass. Hartford and New Haven are to the bottom with a lot of parking, less people. So just to show what the different cities look like, this is Hartford, 1957 and 2008. In comparison, this is what Cambridge, the evolution in Cambridge over that same period.
A lot less different, but actually more dense.
More dense from infilling. So the strategy that was used in Cambridge is that they actually kept the urban fabric that was there in the 50s, and they built on top of that. Whereas in Hartford, what we did was we erased the urban fabric. We got rid of roads, we got rid of all the existing buildings, and then built skyscrapers. So that has a lot of implication. It means that in a city like Cambridge that kept its old fabric, it has mixed-use buildings. It has small places where you can have a variety of different types of place, jobs, shops, etc. Something like Bank Street. Whereas Hartford went in the exact opposite direction, where you had all these just sterile towers in the park, in parking lots, in essence. So a very different attitude towards cities.
And yet in New London too, I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission, and so many issues come down to parking and mandatory minimum parking spaces.
Yes.
And this coming year, the city will be updating its plan of conservation and development. So maybe before the end of the evening, you can give some guidance on how we can look at our city's plan of conservation and development and see if the trend can be reversed.
Yes, so a lot of cities now, including Hartford, Hartford just has gone through the process of developing a form-based code, which is looking at the character of the city rather than just looking at the numbers. And
now, I think that's a great idea in New London. How do they go about it? Do they, was it a community push, or were there people in the planning department?
I believe in the case of Hartford, it was through the official channels. In fact, the head of the committee that was involved with this change is the wife of the incoming mayor. So.
Oh, okay.
She's a law school professor at the University of Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I'm interested because
So
I think
if we're looking at their process,
it would be probably looking too often zoning questions. There's a lot of zoning, but not much planning.
It's no planning, and it's really what you saw in Hartford versus what you saw in Cambridge is a question of asking what type of city we want. And zoning is often not about that. It's about how can we accommodate the fact that we expect more cars. So it's not about the character of the city. It's not about the financial wealth of the city, nothing like that. It's just this fear that if we don't accommodate more cars, something bad is going to happen. So one of the things we looked at, and this is where that leads to the Bradford-Hayes criteria, is that we compared these different cities, and one of the things we found was that the three on the top, there was almost no increase in parking. And in fact, after the 80s, they started to decrease the amount of parking as a percentage of jobs, etc., compared to these three in the bottom. That they not only did they start a big increase, but it continued till now.
Yeah, it's still going on.
Yes, and that's the part that I find fascinating, is that we have had 60 years of this crazy policy, and it's just now that some of these cities are beginning to understand that it's not working. It's not working for you.
Right, yeah.
So, so the number of parking per commuter, the increase in the three high parking growth cities compared to the other three. But then we looked at other things such as the how people got to work. In the three cities that did not increase parking, fewer people are actually getting to work by car. Which is, I always find this so fascinating. A lot of people don't seem to, but there are cities in America where there are less people driving to work now than in 1960. To me, that's fascinating.
That is amazing.
In comparison, this is what happened in those three cities that increased parking. So what is interesting here is that they increased parking because they said more people were going to drive, and it was true. So the question is, Is more people driving because they increased parking, or did they have to increase parking? Is a question that really
That's true.
come
And
around.
I imagine that as they increase parking, it becomes less convenient to get to work by other means.
It becomes less convenient, it becomes less attractive. It's you know, it's there. It's a cycle that keeps building on itself. So, the amount of people in these cities, the cities that did not increase parking, there was a tremendous increase in people, jobs, and residents. And this is the direction in
The
in those
jobs
other
and
places.
residents left.
Yes. Per capita income. So it just keeps on going on and on and on. That it doesn't seem to have worked. The policies that we adopted in the 50s about transportation. I don't know if it caused the loss in income, but it certainly didn't work to preserve the character of the cities.
And I guess it is giving an example of what the costs are of parking.
Yes, exactly.
If the people driving the cars aren't paying the cost of parking, well, the jobs are leaving, the people are leaving.
The jobs leaving, the people are leaving, the cities are suffering.
The tax base is
The tax base is
shrinking.
going, and the people that are moving are working in these cities are working in places that they want to flee as soon as they get out of their offices.
And I know one of the big employers in New London right now is Electric Boat over on Pequot Avenue. And they have a horrible parking problem there. There have just been signs that have been put on side streets that are now resident permit only.
Right.
There just has to be a better way.
And I would advise them to speak to the manager at Traveler that looks at transportation and parking demand management.
That's interesting that the insurance company has taken a very holistic view
interesting
of it.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting from the fact that they do understand the value of money.
Yeah, I guess so.
So, getting back to this issue of cause and effect, is it the parking, or did the parking come? Well, I don't know if parking come about because the city was just falling apart. So, we decided to go to this epidemiology kind of approach, and it was based on this idea of what people felt about smoking when the cigarette companies were trying to convince us that smoking did not cause cancer. So it was this Dr. Austin Bradford Hill who wanted to look at this connection between smoking and lung cancer. And he developed the Bradford Hill criteria. And the criteria says that you look for the relationship. Is there a strong association between the two variables you're looking for? Is there a consistent relationship? Is the relationship specific to the two parameters? Did one come before the other? So a temporal, a dose response. Is it plausible? Is there theory that would support this? And are there some experimentation that would support this? And what kind of knowledge can you build? So we looked at these criteria. This was done by my former PhD student, Chris McCahill, and he did an amazing job really paying attention carefully to these criteria. And what we concluded was that, yes, indeed, what we're seeing is a cause and effect relationship, that more parking is the less city.
And the dose response part is actually interesting to me because it does seem as though the more the cities went this route,
yes,
the greater the effects we're seeing.
Yes, definitely. One of the interesting things for me is state capitals, because state capitals seem to have gone down this road with much more vigor than other places. So if you look at places like Albany, New York, or Hartford, Connecticut, and Trenton, New Jersey, and I mean, they're all sad examples. A lot of money was poured into destroying these cities, sadly. So is in essence, this is what we think we can conclude from our research is more parking, more driving, less city. And so we see many cities around the country that are waking up to the fact that we need a different approach. And I originally developed this presentation for the Mayor's Institute, which is a National Endowment for the Arts program, which brings in mayors, 8 mayors each time, to meet with 8 design professionals. And the idea is to educate mayors about urban planning issues. And I attended one last fall in Bentonville, Arkansas, the capital of Walmart.
Oh.
And they're just the city up the road from there, Fayetteville, down the road from Bentonville, just eliminated minimum parking requirements.
So that is one path forward. Now, how does that work in the short run? Does it?
Well, it doesn't change what is on the ground, but it makes it easier to build things. So in a lot of cities, you can't build anything new because you need so much parking. You need to assemble the parking. So it keeps down the possibility of development.
And I think even in New London, not necessarily so much downtown, but in the Hodges Square area, the business owners there have come up against that they want to develop more storefronts where there are a couple of residences, and the parking, they don't have land for the parking requirements.
So the parking requirements, in essence, say that we need it. The emphasis is always on providing enough parking, regardless of what that does to the city. So by eliminating minimum parking requirements, cities like Fayetteville are trying to get back to the situation where they can have new development in their downtowns.
So that's something that, like, in addition to things like the form-based code, is something that can be looked at when we look at changing our plan of conservation and development.
It's essential. I mean, you have a land bank in downtown New London that could be used, but parking would probably be one of the big obstacles to using that land. So I ended my presentation in Bentonville with this picture to show just how ingrained in the culture this issue of parking is. So this is the Michigan Theater in Detroit, Michigan. And I think leveling buildings to build parking lots and parking garage is sad.
Right.
But when you don't even bother to level the building, you just take a magnificent building like this and put in a slab.
It's like a parking cathedral.
It's like it's like a parking cathedral, but to me it's like a tomb. Yeah. It's like a mausoleum for the city. So this is, and the irony about the Michigan Theater is that it was built on the site of Henry Ford's garage, where he developed the Model T.
How
so
perfect.
Just this is another view of what that looks like. And you also notice it's empty. That's another thing that is fascinating about this.
And it was probably filled with people when it was a building.
It was a 300,000 people movie theater. It was one of the magnificent theaters in Detroit. So so these are the steps that I suggested to the mayors in Bentonville. And so the first one is, when it comes to parking, you need to know what you have, because a lot of cities don't even know how much parking is there, how the parking is being used. They don't have any data about basic things like that, and they're trying to manage parking. Then the second thing is, once you have the basic data, then you actually develop a plan to how you're going to manage it. Maybe if you look at cities like Northampton and Brattleboro, they actually manage parking, they share parking, so they are able to get by with less parking. They charge for parking. So all of those things are part of a management plan that helps to use the very scarce resource of land in a city in a way that is beneficial to the city.
And shared parking seems to have such potential. In New London, over the last 10 years, we've had quite a few situations where churches have demolished buildings
Yes.
to create parking lots.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other parking available on Sunday.
Yes, definitely.
That's used by employees during the week or schools.
The big thing is that nobody manages this thing. So, I wrote an article once where I'm saying that we treat parking, it's so important, but we treat it as if it's garbage. We don't really pay any attention to it. Even in research, it's not paid attention to. This is like, when we first did our first research project, it was like pulling to get the funds to actually do it.
Okay.
So know that parking is never free. Minimum parking, get rid of minimum parking requirements. And then the last point that often we don't think about is that on-street parking in most cities is the most valued type of parking. A lot of cities, including New London, got rid of on-street parking. So that street parallel to Bank,
Right.
which is like a highway soar through your city.
Yeah.
There's no parking on the street, but it passes through these massive lots. There's a lot of reasons why on-street parking is important. Firstly, it's much more efficient than surface lots. For the same area, you can provide more parking on street than you can on a surface lot. Secondly, it makes this street operates like a city street rather than a highway. So it slows down the traffic. It makes it much more comfortable for pedestrians.
Yeah, probably safer for pedestrians as well.
Safer for pedestrians, but it's also the most valued. That's where people actually want to park when you're trying to get to a business.
So when you're thinking about the parking not being free, it's
Yes.
most not free on the street.
It should most not be free, and you want to charge for that parking because it's so valued. So you want to provide it, but you also want to charge for it, and people understand that this is something that is valued and that is useful.
I think there's a psychological piece to it too, that if people know they're going to be paying a certain small fee for parking,
Yes.
they can plan for it. What we have in New London now, it's like playing Russian roulette.
Russian roulette, yeah.
It might be free, or
Yeah.
you might be
Yes.
paying big bucks.
Definitely, and it's what you described to me sounds like the worst of all worlds. The idea of giving tickets for not being in the place long enough,
Yeah,
but not charging for parking.
yeah. It's but there are some ways forward.
But it's really tough to do. I did some work in Nantucket, looking at their transit, and we had given them some recommendations, and they followed almost all the recommendations, and they tried to implement parking in Nantucket, and that was the one that failed. It's really
It's
tough.
the public will is not on your side.
You have to, yes, you're correct, and you have to have the leadership that can sell it, and you have to have that discussion about why it's important.
Well, now that we've talked about parking, let's talk a little bit about streets. And we only have about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
So I want to share some of these, or give you the opportunity to share some of these ideas. We already talked about the traffic being really fast, the way a lot of our streets are designed.
So let me just, I think this relates to both subjects. While I was putting this presentation together, for some reason, this object came to mind, this punch card. And why it came to mind was the idea that this is what we've been doing to our cities, is that we've been trying to fold, spindle, and mutilate.
And succeeding.
And a city needs to be treated with kid gloves. We need to appreciate what it is, how it works, and the street is a part of that. New London, I think that's the biggest issue here. Parking is a big issue, but I think the big issue here is that the street and the street network has been so, I guess, mutilated is probably the right word for it. And so, yeah, I think that's the, let's try to get to the urban street design. And one of the things that I've been doing at UConn is research on a concept called shared space, which is, it means a street that is designed, it's a city street that is designed for different types of users, not just for moving cars. So this is an example. This is an older street in Amsterdam that I would say is a shared space street. And so this partly comes out of the fact that over the last 10 years, the attitude towards designing streets in America has gone through a huge change. And we're seeing these new street design manuals coming out, and you hear in terms like complete streets. And so we're trying to get back to the pre-1960s attitude where streets was not just about moving things. So shared space means places that shared spaces are streets that support the economic, the social life of the place. And it's not just about, it allows movement, but it's not just about movement. And it's an old idea. This is an older street in Amsterdam, but it's an idea that is slowly being rediscovered. It's taking hold in the UK, in the Netherlands. It's in the US, it's much slower to get there. Okay. This is an example of Kensington High Street, of a shared space in a very busy major street in London. So what shared space is really reconsidering how urban space is used. So in typical design, we're focusing on signs, signals, and lines as being the way that we control people's behavior. The idea in shared space is that those play a less prominent role.
Well, and sometimes the signs and the signals are ambivalent. They send mixed signals. You have streets that are wide and smooth, and you just want to go fast. And even if the sign says 25 miles an hour, no one's going 25 miles an hour. You hit upon
a very, very important point, is that the attitude for a long time in US design has been, we build everything wide, and if it's running next to a school, they will put up a sign saying 25 miles per hour, and you'll be prosecuted. So, but even though the design is telling you, ignore the school and drive 60 miles per hour, the sign is going to be able to control your behavior.
Right.
And this, the idea of shared space is the opposite, is that you design so that people understand how they should behave. So the design is what really governs how the space is used. So this is my street in Storrs, Connecticut, which is a street without sidewalk, but is one of the most walkable streets in Storrs. A lot of people come up there to jog, but there's a lot of features there that signals that this is a low-speed facility. Another example of shared space in a more informal setting on Cape Ann in Massachusetts. So the idea of shared space is attributed, the modern day idea, to Hans Munderman, who was a Dutch engineer. He died 8 years ago now. And he had this concept that we really should be designing streets, that we should be putting more power into the operator's hand. We shouldn't be using all these signs and signals, etc. The design should be telling people what to do, and then people would use it appropriately. So according to Munderman, the best public spaces are shared spaces. Whereas with contemporary traffic design, it's all about regulation and control. So what
Yeah.
Monoman pointed out that I'd really not understood before I got into studying shared space was this idea that what we have been doing for the last 50 years in terms of transportation design is that we're treating everything in the same way. We're treating all of our design as if we're designing the highway. So we developed a very sophisticated approach to designing highways in America. And then we decided that all we had to do for city streets was to make it smaller. So we brought the highway design into our cities. And that's essentially what you see in your streets in this town to a large degree. So Monument talks about system time, which is the highway type of design where you're designing for traffic behavior. And it's single purpose, it's regulated, it's impersonal, it's uniform, and it's predictable. Compared to context time, which is what you need in cities, where it's more about the social, where people interact with each other, and where it's multifunctional, it's culturally defined, it's personal, it's diverse, and it's unpredictable. And that's exactly what you see in cities, even though we have tried to design that out of how people behave. So it's a fundamentally different way of looking at streets for cities. And actually, I think New London does have a kind of a shared space right in front of the train station.
It does.
Yes, it doesn't quite work right in terms of the design, but that's an example of what that would look like. So this is a caricature of this is London, of what the conventional design is. So you design the road and then you try to get people to behave using gates and fences, etc. And this is a caricature of shared space. There's actually an intersection that looks almost exactly like this in London called Seven Dials, where the behavior is very much like this.
Just warning you, I was just told we only have 5 minutes
Okay.
left. So continue,
Yes.
but we'll be aware.
Okay, so I'll just skip over this. So one of the interesting things I found fascinating is how we went from shared space, because that's what we had in older cities, to this more controlled environment where we were supposed to behave a certain way. And I found this when I was living in Zurich in 2011. And this document is about traffic education, this is the translation, definition of the road, forcing pedestrians to behave. And it's showing on the right side how not to behave. This is how the Swiss used to behave. They would cross anywhere, they'd get in the way of the traffic, etc., compared to what they're supposed to do now. What I find interesting and fascinating about this, and I was really fascinated by this, is that in Zurich these days, they're actually going back to the left-hand side behavior.
Wow.
The shared space. And this book, Fighting Traffic, also talks about that history in America, how we went from where city streets was for everybody to a situation where city streets was for cars. And this book talks very eloquently about that. So this is an example of a shared space in Zurich. It's a little bit complicated, I won't get into it, but it's an amazing space with the trains, the trams, the buses, everything.
There are spots in Portland, Oregon also that are similar.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, Portland is definitely going in that direction. This is that same location. But this is an example of one from Munderman's home province in the Netherlands. So this was an intersection with conventional controls, and they decided that they were going to deregulate it, and this is what it looks like now. A very, very different experience. A few years ago we went to look at it. It works really, and people there are just so excited about the changes in their
Probably
cities.
safer as well.
Actually, one of the things we found was it wasn't necessarily safer, but it wasn't less safe. In some cases, it was safer. But what is surprising is that it's much, much more efficient in terms of moving traffic.
Well, that is interesting.
So that's an example of that location. A picture of that location at night and a report about its safety. I'll just skip through this. Kensington High Street is more fascinating because it looks more like a conventional street. That's where it's located. They've also done Exhibition Road, which is out there. So at Kensington High, the idea was that they wanted a much more elegant design for this very important high street in London. And just to show why it's shared space, if you look at how these people are using it, so all of those people, none of them are crossing at the crosswalk. So it was designed with that in mind, with the parking in the median. So people would recognize that this is a low-speed facility where you would expect people to be crossing.
Okay, we have to give up the slideshow, I'm afraid,
Yes.
for our last 2 minutes.
Escape key.
Escape key, yes. So as a city like New London moves forward,
Yes.
what would you say are the first steps that could be taken?
So I think the first step in New London is an appreciation of what is still there, of how wonderful Bank Street is, Green Street, I mean, all that still exists there. And
Right.
trying to figure out how we can change the attitude towards transportation and parking to highlight and to enhance the city. So instead of having streets that are highways where people are just speeding from one place to the
Which
other,
they are.
how do you change that to an urban street where people want to be at? How do you reuse some of those lots that have been turned into parking lots?
And hopefully over the next few years, next time you come back down to New London,
Okay.
there will be some better things.
Say goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you, Norman, for coming down.
It's my pleasure.
We'll see you all next week. We have a student from SSDP at UConn, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, coming down next week. So we'll see you then. Thank you.